Brian Kemp has declared May 17th to the 23rd as Safe Boating Week here in Georgia. And it's a very important time as we're gearing up for summer to talk about safety on the water, because each year over 650 people die due to water-related incidences on boats and rivers here in the United States. Joining me now to talk about how you can keep yourself and your family safe this summer is Andrea White with Georgia Rivers. Andrea, thank you for joining me today.
Absolutely. So happy to be here.
So a tragic stat, 650 people each and every year in the United States die on waterways here in the United States. What's the easiest way that those can be prevented in the future?
Oh, wow. By far, the easiest thing to do is just wear your life jacket. This little piece of flotation is the thing that stands between most people and going home with a smile on their face. It's, you never fall off the boat because you plan to. So having this thing on, that makes all the difference.
That's kind of like when you wear your seatbelt in the car and you put the kids in the child restraints in the car. It's because it's just in case. So that's a great point. And does that go for both non-swimmers and swimmers, that that's a good idea?
Oh, absolutely. You know, what is one of the unfortunate realities of paddle sport fatalities is that the vast majority of paddle sports fatalities nationwide are happening among the folks that are on easy water, on lakes and class 1 rivers, easy rivers. And it's just because they don't think that there's any hazards out there and they get caught off guard. Having this life jacket on is the number one thing you can do to make yourself safer.
And so behind you, you have one of those beautiful waterways behind you. Where are you right now, and what should people know about our area lakes and staying safe on them if they're going to be out through Memorial Day weekend?
Absolutely. Well, I'm here at Allatoona Lake, and what a wonderful place to have close to home. We will have one of our classes at this location this weekend. We'll have 2 locations at Allatoona among the 7 we have statewide. In terms of lake safety, be really careful around the other motorized boat traffic. Always paddle with a friend. And have your life jacket on, because you just don't know what's going to happen. If you hit your head on your own boat or somebody else's, if something untoward happens, if a sudden gust of wind, even just a gust of 20 or 30 miles an hour of wind, which can pop up on a nice day like this, that can really throw you for a loop if you're already tired. So just, be prepared for that so that even if the unexpected happens, you're already good.
And you mentioned those classes happening. So those are Kayaking 101 classes, and those, I believe, are low cost, happening this weekend thanks to many different partners in different areas of the state, correct?
That's absolutely right. I'm here at an Army Corps of Engineers site, but we have many, many local partners that have come together to make this happen to help us celebrate National Safe Boating Week. This training would typically retail for anywhere from $75 to $150 a day, and we're able to make this happen for $15 a person, including your free kayak rental, because of the volunteers, because of the companies donating their boats for the day, because everybody's coming together so that Georgia is not at the top of that fatality list.
And if people want to get involved in that, maybe they're thinking, okay, we're going to buy a kayak, we're going to go out kayaking this summer. How can they register for one of those very reduced cost classes that are happening this weekend? Absolutely.
Follow the Georgia Rivers website. We've got links to sign up for those classes, and it's all over our social media. We've got 7 classes statewide. A few of them have sold.
Thank you for joining us on 11 Alive Plus. I'm meteorologist Nicole Hartford with this weather update. This first round of rainfall is winding down. We're still seeing areas of heavy rain that stretches from Clark and Oconee counties out towards the Athens area, all the way down through Walton County into Putnam County, with some periods of heavier rainfall as well as rumbles of thunder, strikes of lightning. At times, this rain is kind of torrential, but the strongest of the storms has officially shifted out of our area. We've still got this line of severe warned storms now moving through central Georgia, south of Macon. There are also a couple isolated areas of rainfall, some showers developing behind the main line. We are not quite done with the rainfall just yet. Although this first round is winding down, we still need to stay weather aware throughout the day today. Right now, so there's some of the heavier rainfall on the east side of the metro. We've dried out through Atlanta, but as I said, out towards Athens, we've got periods of heavy rainfall, and then this stretches down all the way into portions of even Lamar County off towards the east. We're seeing some heavier rainfall there. These will continue pushing down towards the southeast, which means the rainfall is on its way out. We'll get a little bit of a lull as we go throughout much of the middle of the day today, and then we'll turn our sights to the west to be tracking additional showers and storms, especially as we get into the afternoon and evening. Now, a lot of these storms really packed a punch, especially through portions of our western counties. We have a number of storm reports, especially in Randolph County, Alabama, of trees down, power lines down. Out towards Upson County and Thomaston, we also have reports for power lines down across much of the area there. So emergency managers out working hard to make sure that any trees or power lines that have fallen are quickly cleaned up. In those locations, though, where the severe storms rolled through, it's really important that you take it a little slower on the roads and be aware that there could be tree limbs or down power lines that crews haven't gotten to yet that still need to be cleaned up. So just be very cautious. In LaGrange, out towards Troup County, there also was a tree that fell on a home there. You can see that tree uprooted from the ground. Not only did it fall on top of the home, but it also had some branches that kind of poked through the windows. These photos sent in to us by Troup County Emergency Management. I mentioned the possibility of additional storms later today. As our main line of storms moves out, there is still a severe thunderstorm watch in effect for mainly central Georgia. Technically, Pike, Lamar, and Upson County are included in this, but I think the severe weather threat there has likely ended, and the National Weather Service will probably go in soon and eliminate some of these northern counties out of the watch as that cluster of storms continues to push down towards the south. Instead, we're starting to clear out across North Georgia. This is our view in Noonan. You can see some sunshine coming out. Our Georgia Tech camera still pretty overcast, but again, breaks in the cloud cover already. And we'll see additional clearer conditions through the next couple hours. So we'll enjoy a little bit of lull in activity before the potential for more storms moves in later this afternoon. It's all thanks to this stalled front that's draped across the southeast. You can tell that there is additional rainfall developing through portions of Mississippi, some isolated kind of spotty activity through Alabama. This system is essentially acting as a conveyor belt. So it's sending all this moisture, all these storms off towards the east across our area. Now, our second round of storms could be coming in later this afternoon, and it's this area that we'll be watching currently through Mississippi, where there are a number of severe thunderstorm warnings. But exactly where this stalled front is located will have a pretty big impact on whether or not we see the rainfall here, how widespread it is, and the severity of it. This front is just kind of fluctuating a little bit as far as position goes. If it manages to dip a little bit further south, it could keep most of this rainfall towards the south of us as well. So we'll be watching that really closely this afternoon as that cluster of storms moves into Alabama, to be tracking it for its potential to bring more widespread rainfall here during the later hours of today. Otherwise, just some isolated pop-up activity stretching through portions of the area. Where that stalled system is located, that's where we also have the risk for severe weather. So level 1 to level 2 risk extends throughout much of North Georgia, including Metro Atlanta. That level 2 threat is currently centered around where we had already a lot of the stronger storms earlier this morning. Here's our forecast track throughout the day today. Now, we'll see some clearing. We'll get that first round of rainfall out of the way. So by lunchtime, yes, a little bit of isolated activity is possible, but overall conditions are going to be a lot drier. I guess it's already kind of lunchtime now at 11, but 1 o'clock, few spotty areas of rainfall, breaks in the cloud cover. Overall, fairly quiet. I mentioned we'll be watching for that potential for a more organized cluster of storms once again later this afternoon. This particular forecast model keeps a lot of it down towards the south of Birmingham and pushes it into central Georgia, which would be a good scenario for us, but I don't want to completely rule out that possibility that we'd see rainfall later this afternoon. I would say still stay weather aware if you have those outdoor plans today. Know that some isolated stronger to severe storms are possible, and just keep an eye on the radar if you plan to be outdoors. Temperature wise, it's still going to be pretty warm. We'll get up into the low to mid 80s across North Georgia, running pretty close to where we typically are for this time of year. We'll stay generally just a little unsettled into the start of the week. So a few isolated showers and storms might develop Monday afternoon and evening, mainly into our far northern counties, but most of the day Monday, most of the day Tuesday looks completely dry. Our next storm system comes in by Tuesday night and into early Wednesday morning. So this is our next incoming cold front, swings through Tuesday night, making mainly an overnight event across North Georgia with another risk for strong to severe storms. Level 1 to level 2 threat. This is for Tuesday, but as I said, it'll be late Tuesday night through early Wednesday morning that we're really watching out for this. So most of the day Tuesday, this is 7 a.m. dry. Mix of sunshine and cloud cover, couple isolated areas of rainfall, but it's not until after sunset that main line of storms pushes through. This will sweep across the state, again, because of the timing of this, it being an overnight system for us. These storms are going to be weakening as they push southeast, but some isolated areas of heavier rainfall, the gusty winds, as well as hail will be possible. Tornado threat low, but not zero. This will move into metro Atlanta, kind of grazing the I-85 corridor after midnight on Tuesday night into early Wednesday morning. So that brings our next chance for somewhat more widespread rainfall into the week. Behind that cold front, more of a drop in temperature. So it's still muggy and warm out there today. That'll be the case the next couple of days. But look at what happens to those overnight lows as we go into the end of next week as well as next weekend. We'll fall back down to morning temperatures in the 50s, a little cooler, a little crisper, a little more comfortable, with afternoon highs only in the 70s, more sunshine as well. We do have a couple days of unsettled weather still to get through with daily rain chances today, tomorrow, Tuesday, Wednesday. But as I said, not a washout. We'll be watching for that second round of rainfall later this afternoon, a few isolated storms Monday evening, and then rainfall late Tuesday night into early Wednesday morning. So there will still be plenty of dry time if you are trying to get outdoors. Of course, we'll continue to have updates here on 11 Alive Plus as we track those showers and storms throughout the day.
the Federal Railroad Administration, each American requires the movement of about 54 tons of freight each and every year to get the essential goods that we need each and every day. And much of that is by train. Joining me now to talk about the weather's impact on freight rail and Norfolk Southern's push to be more energy efficient is the company's Chief Sustainability Officer, Josh Ragland. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, you're welcome. Great to be with you.
So for people who don't know, what kind of objects are transported by rail?
We transport a little bit of everything related to the automobile industry, to metals, to chemicals, to ag and forest related products, and including intermodal, which is really consumer facing. So that's a lot of your retail goods that are coming and going either by ship or being produced in the United States and moving domestically. So we work very hand in hand with our transportation partners, which includes trucks and also with maritime.
So why are trains critical for being more sustainable? What makes them different from trucks?
Well, not only do we move the goods that move America, but it's also moving them in the most sustainable way. So for example, rail is up to 7 times more efficient than our main competitor, trucking. That means we can reduce emissions 75% on average, and in some cases up to 90%. So to put that in perspective, freight rail moves around 29% of all freight ton miles in the US, but only produces 6% of all freight related emissions. Trucking, on the other hand, moves around 40% of freight ton miles, but produces 72% of emissions. And most of that are trips over 500 miles. And that's our sweet spot. So we really have the way of moving product the most efficiently, and it's also good for consumers as well, as you think about the wear and tear in our road system and also traffic congestion.
And we deal with a lot of that traffic congestion here in Atlanta, and we also deal with a lot of different types of weather events. When you're driving a truck, okay, there's storms coming in here, I'm going to maybe avoid those highways. Yep. How do you deal with planning for weather events when you're talking about freight rail?
Yeah, so we do a few different things. One is our partnership with AccuWeather, and so that's allowing us to receive near-term and long-term forecasts just specifically for our rail network, which is 19,000 miles long in the eastern 22 states. So we partner with them, we have forecasting, but we also have real-time alerts as well. And so that alerts our people out in the field as we respond to weather-related events. And also very importantly for our Network Operations Center, which is here in Atlanta, that controls all those train movements across the network. So if there's instances where we need to avoid certain areas because of flooding or potential systems, we can reroute trains across different lines on our rail network.
So, we deal with weather events, and we're also planning for the future. Mm-hmm. And a lot of companies have launched initiatives to cut down on their carbon footprint, their greenhouse gas emissions. Your company in 2023 launched its first climate transition plan. Can you tell us more about what are your key pillars of trying to cut down on your carbon footprint for you all and also for your customers that are using your freight rail for shipping?
Yeah, so several things that we're doing internally, first of all, is continuing to decarbonize our own efforts. That's going to be a lot towards locomotives. That's over 90% of our scope 1 and 2 emissions, for example. So a lot of efforts on investing in our locomotive fleet. We've been modernizing over 100 locomotives a year since 2016. We've improved fuel efficiency over 12% just in the last 5 years, for example, and it's set record quarterly fuel efficiency just the last 4 quarters, to put that in perspective. But we're also investing heavily in biofuels, such as biodiesel blends. A 20% blend of biodiesel, for example, can reduce greenhouse gas emissions up to 15%, but it's also reducing particulate matter as well. So we've more than doubled our use of biodiesel just in the last 2 years. And then thirdly is renewable energy. Not only using renewable energy, but also cutting down on our consumption as well. And so those two things together, we've reduced our electricity emissions around 30% just in the last 5 years.
So you're telling me it's not a one solution fits all. It's kind of diversifying many different areas that you're trying to reduce that carbon footprint.
That's right, and we've modeled those levers, and we feel like there's a pathway to reach our near-term target, which is in 2034. But we're also not just stopping there. We're looking at other technologies. We're working with our traditional locomotive OEMs, but also looking outside of that system as well as we think about what are those solutions of the future or those innovations that need to happen.
And one of those innovations for your customers you launched just this year is RailGreen. Can you tell us more about how that works and why your customer base was giving you feedback that that's something they're interested in?
Yeah, so Rail Green relates back to our usage of biodiesel products. I told you that's part of our strategy, and we've been learning from our partners in maritime that have similar programs related to green fuels they're using in their ships. And so, but we were getting an advantage by using biodiesel in our emissions, but we didn't have a credible, transparent pathway to pass that along to our customers. And so now with Rail Green, we partner with the Smart Freight Center in Amsterdam, 123 Carbon as well, and now we have a verified process to verify our emissions reductions, create Rail Green certificates from that, and now have a legitimate way that we can pass those certificates along with our customers that want to participate in that program.
Are you getting positive feedback, or have you gotten any feedback that customers feel like it's greenwashing?
You know, we've actually had customers asking about this before we even launched. So a lot of our customer network, so think of multinational companies, retailers, a lot of your consumer-facing brands are very incentivized. You know, consumers like us, we want green products, we want green shipping, green solutions. And so we've had a really positive momentum there. Just last week, we made an announcement with the Port of Virginia on creating the country's first Rail Green corridor, going from the Port of Norfolk to the inland port there in the state of Virginia. And we're receiving a lot of positive feedback and customers reaching out to us because of that.
So that's a new initiative. What about your pipeline for the future? Are there any other technologies and stuff that you're experimenting with to make your company even more sustainable?
I would say the one that's probably most exciting recently is we partnered with a small tech company called Remora. And so it's about how can we create systems to actually treat the exhaust. So I actually met Remora, the CEO, 4 years ago. They were working on truck technology. They had 5 employees at the time. Recently I went up to see them in Detroit. They've got 50 employees and they've got $117 million in capital investment. And now they're getting into the rail space. So we announced a pilot project with them. They're creating a capture tender that will follow behind the locomotive, treat the locomotive exhaust. This is going to reduce the CO2 emissions by 70%.
So trying to carbon capture?
The carbon capture, but at the same time it's going to reduce the particulate matter and nitrous oxides by 90%. It's a huge benefit for air quality.
I was going to say that's probably a big deal for air quality because your train lines are going through a lot of communities here in Georgia.
Yep, that's right.
Based here in Georgia. Now, speaking of those trains going through a lot of Georgia communities, you know, you have this big effort towards being sustainable, launching your climate transition plan. Are there any outlooks in your future for trying to reduce the amount of toxic materials being transported, or are you focusing on safety in other ways to make sure it's safe for all those communities?
You know, I'd say we've had a lot of focus. We're a very safe industry, and we've even had more focus on safety. I would say a lot of our partnership on technologies related to AI and machine learning. So we launched our digital train inspection portals just within the last 2 years. And that's a great technology for inspecting full trains, 360 view as those trains move at rail speed, so it's 60 miles an hour. And so that's made a huge difference in mainline accidents. And so just this last year, we set the record for the industry in mainline accident derailments, so the lowest that we've seen. And that's in partnership with Georgia Tech Research Institute, which is right here in Atlanta.
Yeah, so you're working on making sure that you're reducing your carbon footprint, but at the same time, you're also evolving technology to keep things very safe.
That's right.
Josh, if you had to give kind of a pitch to Georgians, you know, this is a Georgia-based company. What's the biggest motivating factor for them to support Norfolk Southern going forward?
Yeah, I would say we're a very sustainable company. We chose Atlanta for a reason. You know, partly it's because it's a logistic hub of the Southeast, and it's also a tech hub. So there's a lot of things that Atlanta and the state of Georgia brings to us, and we've had a long-term presence in the state as well. You know, we've got 4,000 employees. We've got over 1,700 miles of rail network. So we've been in Georgia a long time, and we're now proud to call it our home state and continue to move the goods that move the economy and work with partners like Georgia Ports Authority, for example, or our 1,200 customers in the state to further reduce both environmental impacts and society impacts from freight transport.
Josh Ragland, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. Great being here.
North Georgia, generally unsettled weather. So your Saturday as well as your Sunday, you'll need to stay weather aware and also just be aware that there is a possibility for some rainfall. No one day will be a washout. Showers and storms look most likely Saturday morning, and then we'll have some more activity pick up again into Saturday afternoon. By Sunday, isolated activity is expected, and we'll be watching for larger developed kind of clusters of showers and storms that move in from Alabama, Tennessee, and Mississippi over the course of the weekend. Multiple rounds of rainfall are expected. Overall unsettled, not just here in North Georgia, but for much of the continental U.S. Throughout the day on Saturday, we're tracking thunderstorms along a passing cold front. You can see that area of low pressure that stretches through portions of Michigan, bringing rainfall through the Midwest down into the southeast, and yes, a low-end risk for severe weather. So some isolated storms could bring gusty winds as well as small hail. Tornado threat overall very low as we go through Saturday and Sunday. That forecast track shows the rainfall kind of stretching off towards the east. The East Coast a little more unsettled, and then some rainfall more likely as you get over towards California into Washington and Oregon, as well as stretching down into Nevada. Temperature-wise, a lot cooler behind this cold front. So while we've been battling some near record high temperatures the last couple of days across the southeast, we will start to see a little drop in those highs as we progress through the weekend. Temperatures through Minneapolis into Chicago already feeling the impact of that passing cold front. If you do have travel plans throughout the next couple of days, it is a good idea to make sure you stay aware when it comes to your flight and whether or not it makes it out on time, because this unsettled weather could have impacts on flights across the country. Into Sunday morning, still just generally unsettled. We'll also introduce the possibility of perhaps a little bit of wintry weather stretching through portions of Utah, up towards Idaho, Wyoming, as well as into Montana. Temperatures down towards the surface, for the most part above freezing. It's really once you get into those higher elevations that a little bit of snowfall is possible. Otherwise, scattered showers and storms. Another storm system will send more rounds of rainfall across the Midwest and into the southeast, resulting in at times very heavy rainfall. We'll keep that unsettled pattern going into the start of next week as well for the southeast and again for much of the country.
Brian Kemp has declared May 17th to the 23rd as Safe Boating Week here in Georgia. And it's a very important time as we're gearing up for summer to talk about safety on the water, because each year over 650 people die due to water-related incidences on boats and rivers here in the United States. Joining me now to talk about how you can keep yourself and your family safe this summer is Andrea White with Georgia Rivers. Andrea, thank you for joining me today.
Absolutely. So happy to be here.
So a tragic stat, 650 people each and every year in the United States die on waterways here in the United States. What's the easiest way that those can be prevented in the future?
Oh, wow. By far, the easiest thing to do is just wear your life jacket. This little piece of flotation is the thing that stands between most people and going home with a smile on their face. It's, you never fall off the boat because you plan to. So having this thing on, that makes all the difference.
That's kind of like when you wear your seatbelt in the car and you put the kids and the child restraints in the car. It's because it's just in case. So that's a great point. And does that go for both non-swimmers and swimmers, that's a good idea?
Oh, absolutely. You know, what is one of the unfortunate realities of paddle sport fatalities is that the vast majority of paddle sports fatalities nationwide are happening among the folks that are on easy water, on lakes and class 1 rivers, easy rivers. And it's just because they don't think that there's any hazards out there and they get caught off guard. Having this life jacket on is the number one thing you can do to make yourself safer.
And so behind you, you have one of those beautiful waterways behind you. Where are you right now, and what should people know about our area lakes and staying safe on them if they're going to be out through Memorial Day weekend?
Absolutely. Well, I'm here at Allatoona Lake, and what a wonderful place to have close to home. We will have one of our classes at this location this weekend. We'll have 2 locations at Allatoona among the 7 we have statewide. In terms of lake safety, be really careful around the other motorized boat traffic. Always paddle with a friend. And have your life jacket on, because you just don't know what's going to happen. If you hit your head on your own boat or somebody else's, if something untoward happens, if a sudden gust of wind, even just a gust of 20 or 30 miles an hour of wind, which can pop up on a nice day like this, that can really throw you for a loop if you're already tired. So just, be prepared for that so that even if the unexpected happens, you're already good.
And you mentioned those classes happening. So those are Kayaking 101 classes, and those, I believe, are low cost, happening this weekend thanks to many different partners in different areas of the state, correct?
That's absolutely right. I'm here at an Army Corps of Engineers site, but we have many, many local partners that have come together to make this happen to help us celebrate National Safe Boating Week. This training would typically retail for anywhere from $75 to $150 a day, and we're able to make this happen for $15 a person, including your free kayak rental, because of the volunteers, because of the companies donating their boats for the day, because everybody's coming together so that Georgia is not at the top of that fatality list.
And if people want to get involved in that, maybe they're thinking, okay, we're going to buy a kayak, we're going to go out kayaking this summer. How can they register for one of those very reduced cost classes that are happening this weekend?
Absolutely. Follow the Georgia Rivers website. We've got links to sign up for those classes, and it's all over our social media. We've got 7 classes statewide. A few of them have sold out already, but I know, for example, we still have seats in that river class at Chattahoochee Hills at New Riverlands Park. We still have seats with some phenomenal instructors in Columbus at Whitewater Express, and we still have seats in a couple of our lake classes. So fill those seats.
And that's for kayaking, so non-motorized. What about folks that are going to be taking their boats on the water over the summer? I know if you're born before 1998, I believe it is in the state, you don't have to take any kind of safety course. But what would you recommend for folks who might be new boaters or have been boating for a long time, just to make sure that they're up to date on the best safe information to keep their passengers and themselves safe on the water?
Sure. Well, I do not claim to be the best source for motorized boat safety material, but I know that DNR is the one offering that boater safety course. And the way you get that anchor on your driver's license is you go take that boater safety course, and you always get the most up-to-date information.
Wonderful. And Andrew, one last question, because we are talking about boating, but also we're the weather impact team. We got to talk about weather impacts of boating. What are some key reminders for boaters that are going to be on the water this summer about weather hazards? And if there is disruptive weather moving in, what's the rule generally for keeping safe off the water if there's any lightning?
Sure, absolutely. The number one thing to keep an eye out for in Georgia is going to be those rainstorms, those pop-up storms. Even on a sunny day, you can end up with a pop-up storm. And if you're out on a lake or some kind of open water, that wind can be very, very dangerous, and lightning, to your point, even more so. So if you're on open water and you start hearing thunder in the distance, you need to get off the water. If that lightning hits the lake, it's going to go all the way across that water. That water will send that lightning across the lake. So if you're on open water, you need to get off that water. If you're on a river, if you're kind of in flat water, you need to figure out the smartest way to get off the water in an expeditious fashion. If you're in a gorge where you're the lowest point, there's some judgment calls to be made. But either way, you need to be weather aware. You need to be very cautious. You need to understand what you're dealing with. And we know we'll all have more fun if we plan for the rain and plan to be in the right place when the rain happens.
I love how you put that, and also you said the wind, because as we see storms come in, sometimes we can get storm outflow, gusty winds, even 30 minutes before the rain hits. So those are all great reminders. Andrew White with Georgia Rivers, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about Safe Boating Week here in Georgia, running through the 23rd.
into the 2025 hurricane season, the National Hurricane Center is rolling out some major updates aimed at keeping you safer and better informed when storms threaten. From faster warnings to new risk maps, these changes are designed to improve how we prepare for tropical systems. And joining us now is National Hurricane Center Director Michael Brennan. Dr. Brennan, thank you so much for joining us. You know, this year we understand the NHC will be issuing watches for potential tropical cyclones or storms that haven't really formed yet 3 days in advance instead of 2. So can you talk about what's behind this change?
Yeah, potential tropical cyclones are systems that we've issued advisories on back through 2017. So when we first started this, it gave us the ability to start issuing our forecasts and products and watches and warnings before we even had a tropical depression or tropical storm for systems that are forming near land. You can think we did that during Helene last year, for example, when it was forming over the northwestern Caribbean. We knew it was going to bring the potential for land impacts within about 2 days, so we were able to start putting our forecast products out and get watches and warnings up for those hazards, whether they be wind or storm surge, or get information about heavy rainfall out. So the change we're making for 2025 is we're going to start to issue those forecasts as much as 72 hours in advance. It's not going to change the watch warning time frame. Watches are still going to come out about 48 hours in advance of the onset of hazards, whether that's for storm surge or wind. But if we have high confidence that there's going to be significant impacts from a system on land within 72 hours, we'll be able to start putting out our track and intensity forecasts, get information about probabilities of significant winds and storm surge out to the general public, and give them more advanced lead time to prepare.
And is that just the result of better modeling and better forecasting advances?
Yeah, I think so. You know, when we started the potential tropical cyclone concept back in 2017, I think we had some reservations about trying to get forecast information out there too soon because there is increased uncertainty when we don't have a system that's yet a tropical depression or tropical storm. But we've used it so often. We used it 9 times in 2024. This tool in our toolbox, and we've had some very significant hurricanes develop near the United States and make landfall within just 3 or 4 days. So we found that we wanted to give ourselves that option to be able to get that information out a little bit sooner when we have high confidence that there's going to be significant impacts within 3 days.
Let's talk about the cone of uncertainty that will potentially benefit inland communities. We certainly saw what happened in North Carolina with Helene last year. Talk about the changes to the cone and how it could really help save some of those lives.
Yeah, we had an experimental version of the cone graphic that we introduced during last hurricane season in the August timeframe. And the change with that was it depicted the inland extent of the tropical storm or hurricane watches and warnings, showing that wind hazard over inland areas of the United States. What you're looking at here on the left is sort of our traditional cone graphic that only showed those watches and warnings on the coast. And this is an example from Helene. On the right here, you can see the experimental version shows those watches and warnings covering almost the entire state of Florida, all of Georgia, portions of South Carolina and North Carolina, better conveying that inland wind risk to users, and also reminding users that impacts often do extend well outside the cone itself because we made the purposeful decision to cover up the cone with the watch warning information so that users would pay more attention to that.
You know, you alluded to rapid intensification earlier, the fact that so many of these storms tend to blow up right near the coast and become very strong very quickly. What about forecasting for rapid intensification? Any significant changes there?
So rapid intensification is the increase of a tropical storm or hurricane's peak wind speed by at least 35 miles per hour over a 24-hour period. And it's always been one of our biggest forecast challenges, as you mentioned, especially for systems that rapidly intensify right before making landfall. This is a chart showing our average intensity forecast errors when rapid intensification occurs. And if you go back about 15 years or so, our average intensity forecast error just 1 day out when rapid intensification happened was about 30 miles per hour. So our intensity forecasts were off by that much. Now we've been able to reduce that error down to almost half. We're closer now to 15 to 20 miles per hour off. So while we're not perfect, we are making much more aggressive intensity forecasts for these rapidly intensifying storms. And actually, we never used to actually explicitly forecast rapid intensification. But if you go back to Helene last year, that marked the first time we had ever forecast a system that wasn't a tropical storm yet to go on and become a major hurricane. So we're making a lot of progress there due to improved modeling, the data we're getting from Hurricane Hunter aircraft that are used by the forecasters here at the Hurricane Center and also go into the models, and just the confidence and experience of our forecast staff here.
And I understand you will also be making some changes when it comes to rip currents, issuing now rip current maps for current in the current day and the next day. But what would be different about these compared to what the local offices are issuing?
Yeah, all this is a compilation of all that information that's coming from local National Weather Service offices into one map that will be shown on the Hurricane Center webpage at hurricanes.gov to kind of give users a big picture look at where that rip current threat is anytime there's a tropical storm or hurricane that's active in the Atlantic or even in the East Pacific Basin. Because again, rip currents are one of these sort of underrated hazards in tropical storms and hurricanes, especially along the U.S. East Coast. You can have a storm passing more than 1,000 miles offshore. The weather can be really nice to go to the beach, but the ocean can be very dangerous because of the large wave field that's been generated by the hurricane itself. So it's just a way to draw attention to that information from a national perspective and encourage users to go down to that local information and always pay attention to any warning flags or caution that's been provided at their local beach.
Okay. Well, storm surge, certainly a big killer, but also difficult to forecast. I want to talk about Hawaii and the probabilistic storm surge guidance that you'll be issuing this year. Explain what that means really to our viewers and why it's necessary for Hawaii.
Yeah, storm surge is historically had the potential to kill the largest number of people in tropical storms and hurricanes, and it's very sensitive to the storm surge that you get at one particular location. Is very sensitive to the exact track and the intensity and the size of a storm. So understanding that we actually have errors in our forecast of the storm, we have to approach storm surge from what we call a probabilistic perspective. We have to account for that uncertainty in the track and the intensity and the size. So we're introducing that capability out in the Hawaiian Islands now. We've had it in the United States, mainland U.S., as well as for Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands for many years. But it allows us to look at hundreds of different potential storm scenarios and get an idea of the likelihood of what storm surge could occur at a given location. And that capability will now be available in Hawaii this season.
Okay, great. Well, you know, Colorado State University came out with its hurricane outlook this year. 17 named storms, 9 hurricanes, 5 majors, above average, slightly lower, though, than last year. So I know you will be issuing your outlook as well. What, though, are your thoughts really on the current pattern, specifically the lack of El Nino this year?
Yeah, El Nino tends to be, when it's present, one of the inhibiting factors to a busy Atlantic hurricane season. So in the absence of El Nino, and we don't have La Nina either, we're going to be in sort of a neutral or in-between state for most of the 2025 hurricane season. So that means that other factors will largely determine how the hurricane season plays out in the Atlantic. What the ocean temperature patterns look like, the wind and pressure patterns, precipitation patterns, and just sort of the overall large-scale circulation across the Atlantic basin. So again, our NOAA's forecast isn't out for another week or so, but it's really important to remind users that regardless of what any seasonal forecast says, you have to be prepared for storms affecting your area every year. We can have lots of impacts and otherwise seasons that aren't terribly busy across the entire Atlantic basin. It only matters what happens in your particular location. And it's worth reminding users, we've had 25 hurricanes make landfall in the United States since 2017. So we've been in a very busy pattern. We don't see any real signs that that is going to change.
Well, we are approaching the 20-year anniversary of the 2005 season and Hurricane Katrina. Hard to believe, but talk about just how far we've come since then in terms of preparedness and forecasting.
Yeah, things have changed a lot in the last 20 years. If you think back to the time of Katrina, our ability to forecast rapid intensification, like we talked about earlier, really didn't exist at all. We were only able to react to the observations we saw and how quickly we saw a storm strengthening from satellite imagery or aircraft data, and then respond to it by adjusting the forecast at that time. Going back to 2005, we'd only been making 5-day track and intensity forecasts for a couple of years. Now we're experimenting with forecasts out to 7 days. And probably most importantly, at the time of Katrina, we didn't have any of the sort of modern storm surge forecast and graphics and watch warning information we have now. If Katrina or a storm like that were to happen again, we would have detailed maps to show users what level of storm surge inundation they need to be prepared for. We now have an explicit watch and warning that highlight areas that are at risk of life-threatening inundation from storm surge, down to the scale of just a couple of miles. And that information really didn't exist at that time. So we'd be much better able to message that storm surge threat. And storm surge was by far the biggest killer in Katrina.
Dr. Michael Brennan, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your thoughts on hurricane season. Hurricane season starts June 1st, ends November 30th. The first name on this year's list is Andrea. I'm Julie Martin. Thanks so much for watching.
not be as widespread as the Great Southern Brood, but we are getting ready for Brood 14 to emerge here this May across parts of the Southeast and up through the Midwest. Joining me now to talk more about this is Dr. Gene Kritsky with Mount St. Joseph University and the creator of Cicada Safari. Thank you for being with me today.
My pleasure. Nice to see you.
So, Dr. Kritsky, can you tell me, this is a 17-year periodical cicada. Where are they going to emerge? Where are some of the hotspot states?
Well, they've actually started emerging. In fact, they emerged over a week ago in the Macon area, and those might have been stragglers from Brood 19 from last year, but they are now emerging in good numbers up in the northeast corner of Georgia, throughout Tennessee, and they're now beginning to come out in nice numbers across the midsection of Kentucky. And even here in Cincinnati, we had about 50 emerge last night, and in the last hour, I've received over 147 people sending me cicada photos of what they're finding in their backyards right now.
Oh my gosh. And you know, I was going to ask you, what do they look like? But we see this wonderful, colorful background behind you. Can you describe to me the difference between periodical cicadas, like what they look like, versus the annual ones that we get here each summer?
Certainly. Well, the periodical cicadas, which you can see behind me, are a little smaller than the annual cicadas. They're different colors. They got bright red eyes, black bodies, and their wings, which are membranous, have these orange-colored wing veins, which make them really stand out. Whereas the annual cicadas that most people will see are almost camouflage colored. They're going to be green, black, and brown with black eyes, sometimes green eyes. And whereas the periodical cicadas come out in big numbers, you see lots of them, the annual cicadas come out in much smaller numbers. And they won't start coming out until right around, probably in the Georgia area, probably around mid-June. We've already started seeing reports from Texas of annual cicadas already emerging, but they gather in trees in small numbers, but they sing constantly, and their calls are that bzz, 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 bzz call that you hear in the late summer and early fall. Whereas the periodical cicadas, you won't forget their call. It's this loud cacophony that just goes on and solid.
I know, and they're such fascinating creatures, right? Because they're under the ground for 17 years, and like clockwork, they all know, okay, this is my year, I need to pop up. How does weather play a role in that timeline of emergence for them?
Well, we now know that periodical cicadas count the years by monitoring what goes on above ground. In particular, in the spring, as the trees start to leaf out, they can detect that increased fluid flow from the roots up to the leaves. So they know that they can determine the passage of time. They come out of the ground when the ground reaches 64 degrees Fahrenheit, and usually after a nice soaking rain. That really gets them to pop. And that's when they start emerging in good numbers. They all don't come out in one night. It takes about 2 full weeks for all the cicadas to emerge. So it's not like if you get up in the morning and you find all these empty cicada shells in your front lawn and on your trees, you didn't miss it. Just go out the next night.
Yeah.
But what we don't know for sure is how they remember what year it is. We've had a couple instances, for example, back in 2006 to 2007, we had an extremely warm January. We had 70-degree temperatures here in Cincinnati. The trees started to leaf out in January. Then come early February, we had a hard freeze. All those buds dropped. And when true spring came later in March, a few thousand cicadas came up a year early because they thought it was 17 years because they detected 2 of those leaf sets in that one particular year. But again, we don't know what tells them this is it, this is the year. We have some hypotheses and experiments going on to try to determine that, but there's still some secrets that they haven't told us.
They haven't told you yet. And you mentioned that when they come up, it's over kind of a 2-week period. But then once they're up, what's their job? What's their job? What are they trying to do?
What they want to do is mate, lay eggs, and die. That's their function of their. The average cicada lives only about a month unless they're eaten by birds or something. But in that 1 month, it's all focused on males singing, attracting a female to mate, and her laying the eggs, and then they die. Yeah. And that's the function of all species is to reproduce, and so they're doing what evolution requires.
And so if people are really interested, really fascinated, and they want to be a citizen scientist, you've created this wonderful app so people can be citizen scientists. Can you tell us about Cicada Safari and how you use it?
Certainly. Well, I will point out that crowdsourcing or citizen science with cicadas goes all the way back to the 1840s when Gideon Smith out of Baltimore started writing letters to newspaper asking people to send him letters or cards if they see cicadas. But Cicada Safari is a free app, Price is Right. And if someone wants to help us map where Brood 14 is emerging this year, they download it from the App Store or Google Play. And when you get the app, it's free, and we don't share any emails with anybody, so they're perfectly safe. No, they're not going to get a lot of emails from Mount St. Joe or something. But what they do is go out on their own cicada safari. They go out looking for cicadas, and if they see a periodical cicada, you turn on the camera, and there'll be a little white box in your camera screen, and you try to fit the cicada in that box, and then take the picture, and when you hit the little paper airplane icon, it's sent to our servers. And right now, we're only about 2 hours behind in identifying all the cicada photographs coming in, and we'll probably have about 1,000 photographs today.
And certainly those hot spots are north of Georgia, but let's talk about who could see cicadas here in the state of Georgia. You mentioned maybe some stragglers from last year's emergence in Macon, but northeast Georgia, which folks could see, would they see them in large numbers or much smaller numbers than last year?
Probably a little bit smaller, but they're going to be up in that very northeast county that borders South Carolina. We've got some reports from there already. I didn't get a lot of photographs from there, so we can't tell you how heavy the emergence is, but we do see them there. You'll see them south of Chattanooga. We have reports from there as well. And it is possible that people who had cicadas 4 years ago might see some, or even last year when Brood 19 emerged, because we now know that some cicadas get their clocks wrong, and they'll come out 4 years late, sometimes 1 year late. And so hopefully people who already downloaded Cicada Safari for previous years can pick up the updates and see if there's any straggler cicadas, as we call them when they come out off cycle, and tell us what's going on with those, because that's important to really understand the whole biology behind the cicada broods.
And fascinating creatures they are. I'm not sure if I'd eat one, but certainly I've been on a cicada safari looking for them, and it was just a good old day of fun. Well, Dr. Gene Kritsky, I want to thank you so much for joining us here today. You've been a huge weld of knowledge, and I hope folks that have those periodical cicadas popping up know how they can report them and be citizen scientists to help you all as well.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
joining us. We are here in May, almost mid-May now, and we are talking with Atlanta Allergy and Asthma about Allergy and Asthma Awareness Month. And I'm joined with Dr. Gardner, who is a specialist in this matter. Dr. Gardner, how are you today?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. First question, most easiest. Why is May designated as Allergy and Asthma Awareness Month? And what makes this time of the year particularly challenging for allergy sufferers?
Well, one thing about May is it's definitely a time of year where we see an increase in the pollen counts. And more specifically, it's tree and grass pollen counts that are increased during this time of year. As a result, we see a good number of people who are suffering from nasal symptoms as a result of their sensitivities. So there are many people out there who are sneezing, having runny nose, itchy eyes. But one thing about pollen is not only can it trigger nasal symptoms, it can actually trigger asthma symptoms as well. So there are some people who are not only having these nasal symptoms, but they may be having an increase in asthma symptoms as well. So shortness of breath, wheezing, chest tightness, those are all symptoms that can be triggered by an increase in pollen counts.
Right, exactly. And we have had a record-breaking season this year so far. I know things are winding down just a little bit, but what could people expect to see during the early summer months?
So during the early summer months, we do have a tendency to see a decrease in the pollen counts. And so those people who are sensitive to pollen sometimes feel that they are getting better. But on the flip side, with the increase in temperatures, the air quality sometimes is not as good. The ozone, that can affect asthma symptoms for some people. So unfortunately, there are some people who continue to have issues with asthma during the summer months as well.
How should those people prepare for the summer? Like you said, the ozone, the air quality, all of that plays a big part, especially if people have asthma. How should they prepare if they are suffering with allergies or asthma?
Well, I think a good start is to definitely make sure that you're seeing a board-certified allergist. As an allergist, one of the things that we can do is test to see exactly what you're allergic to. And our thought process is if we know exactly what you're allergic to, then we can actually counsel you accordingly as to how to avoid your triggers. Or if it's something that you can't avoid, such as pollen or changes in the air quality, a medication regimen or treatment regimen can be tailored specifically to you that should work to better control your symptoms and prevent symptoms from occurring.
Right. Prevention is definitely key to success. Now, I know we talked a little bit about it, but air quality is huge, especially during the summer months. It's hot, it's humid, we're not seeing a lot of breezes come through. We're living in a city. How does air quality and ozone in particulate matter influence asthma attacks or allergy flare-ups?
Well, believe it or not, just like pollen can cause an increase in asthma symptoms, the poor air quality, the ozone, that can actually increase asthma symptoms as well. So as a result, there are people who are experiencing or can experience an increase in shortness of breath, wheezing, chest tightness, and if you are experiencing symptoms like that, again, definitely important to see a board-certified allergist who can work with you to better control and prevent your symptoms from occurring.
Are there specific times of day or weather conditions when people with allergies or asthma should avoid like outdoor activities?
Yeah, so we always tell people if you are sensitive to pollen, number one, when you're indoors, make sure that you're keeping your windows closed, air conditioning on. If you're someone who does like to be outdoors during the pollen season, then actually spending your time outdoors during the evening hours is best, simply because pollen counts do have a tendency to be higher in the morning and they actually peak during the middle of the day. So evening hours are the best time to be outdoors. Lastly, if you are outdoors for long periods of time and if you are sensitive to pollen, when you come indoors, make sure you take a shower, get all that excess pollen out of your hair, off of your skin, and that too can lead to an improvement in symptoms that you may be experiencing as a result of pollen.
Now, here's a tough one. I know that this year we had our largest pollen count ever. It was greater than 14,000 that day. I think it was on a Saturday, which, registers from that Friday. Do you think, by chance, that climate concerns or urbanization could be playing a role in that, or any other kind of changes that you've noticed in recent years?
Well, one of the things that we're starting to see, and some would say that it's a part of climate change, is that our winters are shorter. Our spring seasons are starting earlier, and as a result, we're seeing pollen counts that start to increase during the months of February. And then if the temperatures remain consistently elevated, those pollen counts will continue to be elevated throughout the spring months and then peak during the months of April and May, like we have seen this past year. So, the shorter winters for sure seem to be contributing to the increase in pollen counts that we've been seeing over the past couple of years.
Now, I know that we are approaching summer quickly, and a lot of people are going to be, out and about enjoying time with their children. Maybe kids are going to be on for summer break. Spring break has already passed.
Right.
What do, parents who have children with asthma, how can they prepare during this high trigger season?
Well, if you have not seen your provider or a person who takes care of your asthma recently, it's definitely a great time to touch base. One thing that they can do is make sure that you are on the proper regimen to control your symptoms. If you're on a good regimen and have symptoms despite that, there are medications that can be used as a rescue, so to speak, which should work to quickly improve your symptoms. So definitely touching base with your provider before the symptoms occur is going to be a good thing. And it's also not a bad idea to do that before the kids go back to school, because summer, time flies, and before you know it, they will be back in school. So it's a good idea to visit your provider so that they can get those school forms together for you all. And a lot of times those school forms also detail what's appropriate to control both your allergy nasal symptoms and asthma symptoms as well.
Well, this is the last question. I know that we are probably your favorite meteorologist team, but do you use any weather data to help inform your patients about things they need to prepare for?
Well, I will tell you, one of the things that I have a tendency to look for when I see pollen counts that are increasing is what does the weather look like this upcoming week? And some of the things that can affect pollen, one is rain. If there's rain in the forecast, we usually do see a decrease in the pollen counts. The other thing is humidity or humid conditions. That is another condition that can work to decrease the pollen counts. So if you see that in your weather forecast or while we're watching you, just know that the pollen counts are likely going to decrease with that.
Perfect answer. I love it. Well, Dr. Gardner, thank you so much for taking this time and kind of informing our viewers about what to expect as we head into the spring and summer months and as people really become more aware of allergy and asthma during this month.
Thank you.
According to the Federal Railroad Administration, each American requires the movement of about 54 tons of freight each and every year to get the essential goods that we need each and every day. And much of that is by train. Joining me now to talk about the weather's impact on freight rail and Norfolk Southern's push to be more energy efficient is the company's Chief Sustainability Officer, Josh Ragland. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, you're welcome. Great to be with you.
So for people who don't know, what kind of objects are transported by rail?
We transport a little bit of everything related to the automobile industry, to metals, to chemicals, to ag and forest related products, and including intermodal, which is really consumer facing. So that's a lot of your retail goods that are coming and going either by ship or being produced in the United States and moving domestically. So we work very hand in hand with our transportation partners, which includes trucks and also with maritime.
So why are trains critical for being more sustainable? What makes them different from trucks?
Well, not only do we move the goods that move America,